We can start the presentation.
How do you do that?
What's your PowerPoint? It's this one, right? So, where's the what
I think it's there.
no, when the Zoom page? When the meeting when that share button, share presentation. What happened?
The share button's there, but it's still sharing.
Okay, let's stop sharing. Okay. So this is what I'm.
No, it's okay. Yeah.
Okay, then we can go. Okay, let me flat.
Okay. Oh, it's nice. Perfect. Is it working on the
On our side, but not
on Zoom?
on Zoom. On Zoom, they know.
It says your screen sharing is paused. I don't know what that.
Oh, let's just resume. Why?
I don't know.
Let me check.
Yeah.
Why it was paused? Let's stop sharing. Share screen. This one.
Maybe it's advanced. I think then you go
Okay,
HDMI.
let me see. Oh, your co-host.
I don't know.
So now. Let me see.
Good. Do I need to turn anything in Zoom? I'm muted and got no. Is that fine? Cool. Perfect. Thanks so much, man. I know this stuff is
Because normally, what the challenge it was the notes part. Because normally we run the presentation from the back. So
oh, I see.
yeah,
So in future for this kind of stuff, it's better to do it on a PowerPoint though. Right?
PowerPoint.
Yeah.
I've never used Chrome before, but it also works.
Okay. No. Okay. Cool.
Good morning, everyone. If we can please start taking our seats. We are going to get started shortly. Grab your last bits of tea and coffee and start making your way through. All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of our Media Freedom Festival. If you were with us last night and yesterday, you would have seen that we really had some incredible sessions, kicking off with children in the media in the morning, and then media freedom and the media industry discussion last night. Today, we are looking at AI. This is a workshop slash masterclass where we've got 2 fantastic speakers, facilitators, who will take us through AI. And the aim of the workshop is essentially, sorry, this is a really great description, which I'm trying to, there we go. The aim of the workshop is bridging the gap between AI technology. I don't know what on earth is going on here. Here we go. Bridging the gap between AI technology and individuals, fostering a deeper understanding of AI's capabilities, ethical considerations, and practical applications across various industries. So I'm, for one, really hoping to gain a far greater understanding of AI generally, as well as how we can apply it to media, to journalism, and to our own industries. So I would like to just welcome everyone. I'm going to introduce Nomshado Lobisi and Nkosinkulu, who will take us through the session and facilitate, and who will be introducing our 2 speakers. I would like to also thank our partners for the events. For the whole of Media Freedom Festival, we are supported by the German Embassy, as well as SABC and MDDA, some of who are in the room with us this morning. So I hope you enjoy the session, and please engage, interact, and feel free to ask as many questions as possible. Nomshado, over to you.
Morning, everyone. I'm not going to be the one talking a lot. As mentioned, we've got two amazing facilitators here today. So my job is purely just to introduce them, give them a platform, and obviously just be the moderator for the whole session. A lot of times when we think AI in any conversation, it's either dealt with fear or dealt with optimism, right? Fear of what is this big unknown? How does this filter into my life? How is it going to take over the very aspects of my life that I know? Or how is it going to enhance and actually produce opportunities? So our two facilitators today are going to bring this discussion from two different perspectives. And first up, I'm going to call Paul. Paul McNally is the founder of Develop AI, a company that reports on AI in Africa, trains African journalists to use AI effectively and builds AI tools. They also consult media businesses on their AI strategies. He is the founder of Develop Audio, an organization that produces podcasts and trains African journalists to create quality audio. I think we've got an amazing expert in the room today. Please feel free to jot down any questions you might have for him. So we'll leave the Q&A towards the end of our session today. Paul, over to you. Please give him a round of applause.
Hello, everyone. I'm getting feedback on here. Hang on. Welcome, everyone. Great to be here. I'm working in AI now for almost a year, and I think it's pretty normal for people to, oh, sorry, this is echoing, okay. And I think it's normal in this space for people that have been in sort of innovation and tech and journalism to sort of been confronted with AI with a sense of, like it was mentioned, like kind of fear and a sort of sense that, okay, is this going to be the last thing? We've seen the internet, we've seen social media, and now AI, and like, is this going to be the final sort of death blow to journalism and income for journalists? Like, I've spoken to a lot of journalists over the last 6 months, and they usually come up with a sense of like, okay, like, how do I stop this, or B, learn the processes so then I can kind of be part of it. It's kind of very much like, if you can't beat them, join them kind of situation. And personally, and I think everyone is going to have to do this, and I think the quicker the better, is it is very much a join them situation, right? So I've started this organization called Develop AI, and we report on AI in Africa. So through our newsletter, so you can sign up for free. But we also train journalists to use AI. And this is the crucial thing, to also like code with AI. I mean, this is the thing, right? That, and I'm sure everyone is aware of this, that yes, journalism is under threat in some sense with AI, but also so is like the average job of a coder, right? So we're kind of used to, I think, in these sorts of environments being like kind of revering coders and being like, they get paid these huge salaries compared to journalists, and we kind of need them to increasingly build the things that we use all day. But I think there's also a situation where if you're 21 and you've just spent the last 2 years learning to code in Python, then you're also freaking out in the same way that a lot of journalists are, because, you know, essentially, if anyone's played around with ChatGPT, you can start to ask it how to code for you. You can start to think of things that you might want to build and you might want to code. And it is a laborious process. And believe me, I've been doing it now for almost a year, and it from like zero coding to kind of building sort of prototype apps. And I'm not saying it's easy, but it's way easier than it was a year ago before this, because you can start to query, and basically it's like this thing where if anyone has tried to code in this room, you usually hit this point where you're like, okay, now I don't really know what to do. And now you don't really have anyone to phone, or the people you do phone, you've already phoned them 10 times. And now you're like stuck, and that's it. But now ChatGPT gives that example that if you have a journalism-based app that you might want to build, ChatGPT can help you do that. So we're training journalists to use tools and ones that have already been developed in AI, but also to kind of think about like, okay, what would help you in your journalism life? And then maybe use ChatGPT to code, to build that thing that can then help you. So that's, as you can see, kind of an empowering way to think about this, rather than feel that you're going to get swamped and that you're going to get completely like sidelined. it's a sense of like taking ownership of it in some ways. We're going to a innovation lab next week in Namibia with a whole bunch of startups from Namibia, from Botswana, and they've been proposing ideas that will help their journalism, right? So I sort of bring that up because it's a really exciting aspect to this, right? Is like small newsrooms of like, we're talking like 3-5 people are suddenly looking at this technology and they're not thinking at all that this is a bad thing. Like I spoke to a woman yesterday and she's a one-man outfit, right? She runs a digital platform in Zimbabwe. And she was like, yeah, well, now I can maybe produce a podcast when before I had no time to do that, right? So on the one hand, there is like a real crunch where if you're like, you know, I used to run a podcasting business and you're like, if you're the person who makes that podcast, then suddenly you're worried. But if you're trying to run like bootstrap a media business and you're trying to think about all the things that you would like to do in your media business, now all of a sudden you might have the time to do that. So it's kind of, you know, I understand the apprehension and the fear, but on the other hand, there's huge opportunities to kind of make a 3-person team into like a 13-person team overnight almost. So that's something exciting to kind of keep in mind, I think, around this. So yeah, we also are into developing tools. Like I said, I've been pounding my head against the wall in order to do this for like the last year. And we've got to this point now where we're producing an automated podcast, right? So that the episode went this week, went out this morning. And essentially it's entirely, the code changes all the time to kind of make it better. But the rule is that like, as soon as you click that button, it spits out like a 12-minute podcast episode and you upload that with all the mistakes and anything that it might have produced. And that's kind of what we're aiming for. So to give you an idea, we feed in the URL of that week's newsletter. So if you're like talking about AI news and what's going on in Africa in AI, we feed that into the tool and it spits out a podcast episode of 3 people with synthetic voices chatting about what is in that newsletter, right? So it's not complicated. We're not talking like, it's not really doing like analysis beyond what was in the newsletter originally, but it is creating like some sort of interaction. And we've given the people obviously just synthetic voices, but also a little bit of personality. So the one person is always upbeat, the other person is very miserable, and the other person always tries to make predictions about what is going to happen next, which is kind of an interesting thing, right? Because these models aren't that good really at facts, but they are good at narrative, which is scary if you felt that your strength as a journalist is narrative and not facts, right? Which is kind of my thing. So that's quite interesting. So when you kind of give one of these models the opportunity to kind of imagine what might happen after given a couple of facts, it really goes wild, and it's very good at that. So kind of capitalizing on that, we built that into the podcast, and now it spits out that 12 minutes, and I listen through to it to make sure it's not like, I don't know, gone completely AWOL, but post it exactly as it is. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing. And I think also we're building a WhatsApp community, and I think to your point, like to a grander point, is that we all need to kind of work together on this. I mean, I think it's naive and it's been a part of media for years now, since kind of social media, where big collaboration is kind of the pop word, and everyone is encouraged to work together. And I am a believer in that, but also there's a tension in that, right? Because media is also in competition with each other. They're in competition for donor money, they're in competition for audience, in competition for advertising. And it's a little bit naive for everyone to kind of just give everyone everything for free. So what we're hoping is, as we're kind of moving forward with this, and as people are building apps around AI, that on the one hand, other journalists will help them test the apps because they need a hell of a lot of testing. And I was speaking to a friend of mine who's like an actual developer and has a lot of experience with this. And he's quite like encouraging, but a little bit amused that I'm getting into this space. And he was like, you cannot underestimate how much testing these things need and how much management they need. Even if you create something that's very popular and people actually like in terms of a tool, you will be managing that for the rest of your life. And I think there is something around that kind of community that we can build with other journalists testing and giving feedback on these things, but then also crucially licensing it to each other. And I think there needs to be a kind of almost friendly atmosphere around that, where we can go like, okay, cool. Like you want to use this generation tool or fact checking tool or something like that. It's not unreasonable for one media organization to charge other media organizations a few dollars to do that, right? And I think we kind of need to think around that and adopt that idea as a friendly way of operating. Okay, so I've kind of touched on the idea of coding and this idea of journalist coding. But there's also something interesting around that is like not, and it's been pointed out to me a lot, is that not every journalist is going to want to do this, right? You got newsrooms of people, they are not all going to be interested in building apps and doing that stuff, and that's also fine. Like, but I think it's important for media organizations to identify people that might be interested in this and really encourage them, right? So I think there is something around like when you're kind of adopting a strategy of how you're going to go forward with AI. You know, bigger newsrooms, bigger organizations have like tech departments, right, of developers who are building things. But small organizations are probably going to have to kind of think about those things in-house. Like, who of our journalists, who of our people might actually go with this and run with this? Why they might be interested in that? And I think there is something great about that. I mean, there is something interesting. That's why I've put like, and will ChatGPT eventually just code for them. I mean, if you think about how imaging with AI has gone, in that people can just describe things and get that image, it's not completely unreasonable to think that that might be the case in coding in like a year, you know? So even though you might break your back, like even learning to code with ChatGPT, they might get into a situation where you can just describe what you kind of want things to do, and it might be able to do that for you. I mean, you know, it is mind-boggling in that way. And I think there is an argument to just be like, we're just going to sit on our hands and wait to see how easy this gets and jump in there rather than put the resources in now. So I do get that, but I wouldn't encourage that as a strategy in any way. And this is an interesting thing, right? That I think newsrooms and journalists need to think about is like, what do newsrooms want to achieve? There's going to be a tension between producing content faster, the quality of the content, and then also staff retention, right? So I think some managers like newsrooms are going to look at this and they're going to be like, okay, well, we can produce the same product that we're producing now, but we can produce it cheaper and easier and faster, right? There is sort of there's been pressure for years to more content, right? People that were producing one story a day, once like Facebook and other social medias took over, it was like, well, now you need to produce 5 stories a day, right? So it's not like journalists aren't aware of how much this pressure kind of builds in terms of producing content faster. And I think the bad version of this is like newsrooms use AI as an opportunity to go like, right, we're just going to produce way more content, the same product, and just more of it. I think what's interesting around that is that I would bargain that in a year's time, there's going to be what you would kindly call like a content like apocalypse, essentially, is that people's like audiences idea of what is quality content is going to go up. Like, and that's an interesting thing, I think, because people have talked about AI in terms of it all being a race to the bottom, right? Like when you see something generated in AI, you're like, it looks not very good, doesn't seem realistic, that's fine. And people are like, all content is just going to get worse. But I would argue that the floor for content quality is going to go up. So if you're producing the exact same product as a website or as a podcast or whatever in a year's time, you're going to lose out. You're going to be, to retain your audience in terms of engagement or money is going to be very difficult in a year's time if you're doing the same as what you're doing now. So I would encourage people that this is not the opportunity to just cut costs and produce the same thing for less. It's actually to like utilize the people you've got and really think about how you can make your editorial product way better. Because I think that's the key. Like this phenomenon is going to on the one hand can save you money, but on the other hand can just make your content much better. And you're going to have to do that because, you know, I was at a session around TikTok the other day, and I'm not an expert in TikTok, but even the quality of TikTok videos, even though, you know, you can talk for days about how popular that app is, the quality of the content that's going on TikTok, for example, is getting much better all the time. So that's what, if you think about that as like your sort of lowest form of content, where I'm not against TikTok, but I guess people like me who aren't on the platform kind of think of it like that. the quality of that content is going up and up, and that's only going to increase now. So to even keep up, you need to keep your staff, keep your journalists, figure out the ones that are going to adopt this stuff and then move forward with it. So that kind of leads me to this idea of like what you even teach your journalists, right? Like people come up with tools, they talk about tools, like people have asked me like, okay, so what are the top 5 tools we should teach our newsroom? And there are tools, obviously, that people can get accustomed with. I think it's fascinating that like you see on LinkedIn all the time recently with like people saying they've just started a prompt engineering course or whatever, and this idea of being prompt engineers. And I said the same thing like 4 or 5 months ago, that prompt engineer is going to be a title, it's going to be a thing. And OpenAI have come out quite strictly on that in a number of press releases about like prompt engineering is not something we encourage, because ultimately, if you think about it, prompt engineering is basically saying OpenAI and these chat models are not good enough and you can't get what you need out of them unless you do a course on it, right? And that's not what they want to encourage at all. They're like, no, everyone and your grandmother can use this stuff and get everything out of it. So there's a tension there of like, and not to say that you can't optimize your prompts and get more out of it. I'm not saying that, but the people building these things, they want to make them as absolutely easy to do as possible, right? They're not interested in this kind of magic idea that people were thinking about earlier this year, in that you're going to have this set of skills that can unlock what these models can bring you. Like they're not interested in that. So I think that's sort of interesting, is that you, in terms of like what you would teach your journalists to optimize these tools, it's a difficult set of things that you could be like, all right, we're going to put you on this course, we're going to teach you these tools, and then you'll be fine for the rest of the year. Like that's not the case. Really what it is about teaching people to identify the best tools, right? That's really what this is going to be about. And your ability to kind of work with other journalists, even in other newsrooms, to kind of test and swap out and move on from tools to tools to tools. And I think that's going to be very difficult. I'm going to talk in a moment about like workflow. And I think we all want, as journalists, like almost like a seamless workflow, right? I do this, then I learn this, and you have skills that you get slowly better at, but you kind of know the process, right? Everything from the interview to it being subbed, right? Like that's how, maybe I'm like just showing my age now, but like that's kind of how I think about like producing something in journalism. And I think that even though this workflow optimization is a really big part of AI tools and using AI, that idea of it being seamless, that idea of it being integrated in a perfect way is not going to happen, not for a while anyway. And I think like some people are going to jump in and they're going to build workflow systems. And to be honest, I think those are rapidly going to go out of date. I don't think that's a good like place to put your resources at this time. So I think encouraging journalists to just use tools and be willing to use them for a bit and toss them out is really the way to do it, right? This also leads to this other thing that I wanted to talk about, is that leads to transparency around journalism and their processes. And I think there's something interesting there in that, like, any of us who have worked not just in a newsroom but any office, is you don't really tell your boss, it's not in you to tell your boss that you can do your job faster than they think you can, right? That is not something you ever reveal to your boss in any situation, right? Like Zanzile, who's the director of SITE, which is an amazing organization that I encourage you to look up. They're based in Zimbabwe, and they're doing a whole lot of interesting stuff with AI and innovation in a very difficult environment where like ChatGPT in Zimbabwe is basically sanctioned anyway. So they're doing an amazing work. And he was saying that like, he's very into this and they've got an AI newsreader and all that stuff. But he was also like, junior people, and not even junior, but like, let's use junior people as an example, in newsrooms already using these tools, right? Even if they're not allowed to, even if their editorial policy says they're not allowed to, if they're able to do their jobs quicker and their bosses don't really know or don't care or aren't asking, they will just use these tools anyway and they will hand that in, right? And they'll figure out, and people will say like, oh yeah, but you can run it through certain filters and things like that. But there's also ways to figure out how to get past those filters. I guess the point is that trust is never, and this is not about the technology, but trust is a difficult thing to build between employer and employee anyway. And I think it's increasingly difficult in journalism because I think journalists feel like they've been a little bit hard done by over the years. They've seen retrenchments, they've seen newsrooms shrinking, they've seen all that. So the difficult part of this whole process is going to be reinstituting that trust and getting your journalists to be open about what they're doing. So you can basically interrogate what they're doing and then work that into the workflow of everyone, right? And some won't work, some are unethical. You need everyone to be very, very transparent to their bosses and to each other so you can be transparent to your audience. The difficult part of that is that, like, I feel that journalists are gonna instinctively, and maybe correctly in some instances, think like, okay, I'm gonna tell you everything I'm doing. I'm gonna tell you what I do on a day-to-day basis and how to automate this. I'm gonna help you find the tools, I'm gonna do that. And they're essentially going to like sign their own death warrant, right? They're going to basically construct a system for their boss to give an opportunity to fire them at the end of it and replace them, right? And that could happen in some instances, but I think there needs to be some sort of communication around that. That's not going to happen. There needs to be a trust around that. It needs to be an idea that, like, no matter how much we automate your process, we're going to give you new things to do and new processes, right? Like, people talk a lot about this idea of AI being a tool. It's not a replacement, but, like, to be honest, in some instances, it is going to replace what you do entirely, right? It's it's not really true to go on about it as just a tool. But the people that are agile and are doing that and are helping build, identify these processes, they can do other things. And I think newsrooms, if they have that trust and those kinds of things with their employees, then they'll be able to go, okay, cool. Like, you maybe used to make whatever PowerPoints, you don't have to do that anymore, but we're going to give you these, we're going to give you more complicated, more exciting, and hopefully more fulfilling things to do instead. Okay, so I think that leads a little bit into policy around AI, right? Especially editorial policy. Like, you've seen people roll them out. Deutsche Welle rolled one out the other week, and so did the BBC. And they sort of roll them out in this way that they're almost like the 10 Commandments, right? Like, this is it. This is our final word on AI, right? No, and I guarantee these things are going to change like within months, right? And some newsrooms are very open about how they don't want to use generative AI for their product. I think that's, I think most people would be like, oh, that's fair. I don't want to just read ChatGPT on a website and think that it's written by a journalist. But I think there's a lot of gray area here, and a lot of it is going to be led by the audience, right? A lot of it is going to be like, how much can your audience take? Like, will they be like, right, we don't want any AI in your media, right? What they're reading. Maybe they'll think that. Maybe they'll be quite comfortable with it. But then there's also another thing where if you admit that you used AI, maybe even a little bit, like you just got, yeah, like 10%, or you used it for inspiration, a reader or a viewer might think like, okay, actually, I have no trust in this organization anymore because they use AI for their news content. And once, that gets passed around and it gets misinterpreted, people are like, yeah, they're an AI news organization. It's over now. Like, So there's a difficulty in being very transparent and being very open about that. And I would, obviously, I think as journalists, you want to encourage that as much as possible. But I think there is a flip side where just by admitting something, even if you're, even if you outline it very carefully, the way things can happen in today's media with like a kind of broken telephone is that you could undermine your organization by even putting your face above the trenches, basically, in that sense. So I think that's something that's really interesting. And I think there is also important to like bring your journalists along with this process, right? Because your journalists want your product that they're a part of, that they're linked to be as ethical as possible, right? They want that to be, they don't want that to be undermined, because that also undermines them. I mean, I know it's not linked to journalism, but like in the writers' strike recently in Hollywood, they basically the writers were very encouraged by what they won in terms of AI. And one of these things was like, if AI is used in the creation of a script, then the AI will not be credited, which to me felt like, so the author, if you like, will still get the money and the credit, and the AI credit will not be spoken about. But that to me felt like, that didn't feel like a good win. That felt like worse. So, there's also sort of an argument, I think, with like, especially celebrity-led media, like where you're a face, where you own your voice, and you're, if you think like Tucker Carlson right now, he's not even linked to Fox. He's just on, I think he's on Twitter, but you know, he's a personality, he's known. There is sort of a sort of interesting thing now where a guy like that who owns his own voice and owns his own face can create his own content at an alarming rate. And because he can do it to himself, like, you know, like 11 Labs, which are speech generating software, they ask you to tick a whole lot of boxes, which they don't check, I will say. Like, you can still do it, but whatever. They make you check all the boxes that it's your voice. But if you're a celebrity journalist and you do tick all those boxes and it is your voice, you can now create like what is essentially a 24-hour news cycle of tuckercarlson.com, right? Or something like that. So, and that's not even, you know, no one's even stopping that, and they can't stop it, and people will seek that out. So there is something kind of weird in that I think we think about media and having checks and balances. We think about things, especially when it comes to disinformation. I think people are very focused on and it is scary, right? The deep fakes, all that sort of stuff. But I think what's really going to be the real downturn in terms of disinformation in this is a sense of like the content that people actually seek out, and that being incorrect. Because in my mind, like I was reading something yesterday, which I can share, is that the deep fake stuff, the really like completely synthetic images and videos are going to kind of get filtered out. Like, people are going to figure out how to filter that out. It's going to be kind of like, it was compared, which I thought was quite apt, to like spam, right? If you think about spam 10 years ago, it was like your whole life was dominated by spam. And then they just sort of sorted that out. And I think that's true for the very, very, like, you know, pictures of you naked or whatever. You know, I think that people are going to figure that out, and that will be fine. The thing that's going to be worse is the incorrect information that is like deliberately made by people, and people seek it out. And I think that's the worst thing, right? And, you know, and I mean, I think we've all got people in our families and associates that like seek out that kind of information, and then there's nothing you can do to convince them otherwise. And I think that's a problem that we've been dealing with for years. And I think that's going to get, that part of disinformation is going to get worse. And I think there is something around, just lastly, I just wanted to touch on like this idea of checking your own information as a newsroom and a journalist, especially if you're forced to go to scale. So I think that's something that's interesting. If you're forced by pressures above or financial to produce way more content, and you're still a small group, someone needs to check this stuff, right? And I think there's going to be a bit of a crunch point where organizations are going to be producing too much content to even check themselves. And especially if they allow more generative processes to create that content, incorrect information, and not even maliciously made, but just incorrect, can start to creep into your journalism, right? And I think that's something that's interesting around like big investigations, which to a large extent is very positive, right? This idea of, I'm sure you guys have seen, you can feed in huge amounts of information and get insights. There's a number of small newsrooms who are struggling with the manpower of big investigative journalism, and they want to do that, right? And now they're seeing AI as that process. The thing that I think is interesting, and that is a kind of warning to that, is that if you don't have the manpower to check what it spits out at you, then you can kind of then create an investigation that you don't really know where those insights came from. And, you know, anyone that's been in those kind of situations, it's a nerve-wracking process, even if you're correct, when someone asks you to show you're working as a journalist, right? Someone asks you, like, how did you verify that? How did you know that? Where is the document for that? And my heart is just racing just thinking about that. But the idea that you wouldn't be able to go back and really check that because you didn't have the the team of people that did that, you kind of handed that over. Even if you're correct, even if it did it right, your ability to kind of to just stick up for your own work is going to become complicated. And I actually don't mean for like really big newsrooms that are using it, like, you know, you hear about the Guardian using AI system stuff. I'm talking about like necessary stories that have been made by small teams, and that work is very valuable, but they might not be able to actually like tell you how they did it, which I think is then going to become a problem when they're challenged. So I think that's really interesting. Lastly, and I'm sure people will touch on this more, but the idea of language and cultural bias is something that comes up all the time. And I think we don't have a solution to that, right? There's like talk of there need to be, I was in a conference in Germany quite a bit earlier this year. And obviously this idea of like these big models being built in countries that are in the global north and all that kind of stuff does create a cultural bias, which we can't deny, right? And it's becoming increasingly more difficult in language models because it often doesn't tell you where that bias is and you don't know where that is. But I think it's also difficult to think about like the amount of money that it costs to build these things and the ability for African newsrooms or even bigger companies to kind of think about like building these things, duplicating them in a way that hasn't got cultural bias. So I think it's something that like newsrooms, if they don't collaborate in all the other things I've been speaking about, this aspect of AI and media, they're really going to have to work together on, because I think it's going to take like, and even if they don't do it in a friendly way, just to collaborate on that and how to kind of stamp out not just cultural bias, but also like the ability to translate and use language and all that kind of stuff is really going to be a collective effort. So yeah, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much. It's really great to come here and talk to you about all this. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think it's quite refreshing to hear it from a media and a journalist perspective, particularly in terms of tools, but also how you emphasized on the human factor. As much as we've got technology, it doesn't disregard the mere fact that humans are needed to work side by side with technology. As I said, I'm not here to talk a lot. I'm just here to facilitate. Our next facilitator will be Thorin Pillay. He is a writer, researcher, and a public policy consultant. He holds an LLB from the University of Cape Town, an LLM in international law from University College London, and a great deal of enthusiasm, which you probably see around now, for the world around him. I'd like to call upon, by the way, he's a young gentleman who's really been taking the space up. So I'm sure he's going to give us quite an interesting presentation. Please give him a round of applause.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Nomshado, for flagging I'm young. You wouldn't otherwise have known. Yeah, so there's three things I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the nature of AI. I want to talk about how it can be regulated, and then about how it impacts the media. So I'm kind of going to work through those three. Are we good on the slideshow? Sorry. Sweet. You can go to the next one, please. Cool. Yeah, so before I get into all the details of stuff, I think it's helpful to start with this like parable of the electronic elephant. And what I mean by that is, I'm sure you've heard the story of like a bunch of blind men touching an elephant and trying to describe what it's like. And like one grabs the trunk, one grabs the tusk, one grabs the leg. And they all say, oh, it's like, you know, it's smooth and soft, or it's wrinkly and whatever. And I think there's a similar problem here where technical people have one sense of what's going on and what the issues are. Legal and policy people have another, and media people have a third. And I'm flagging this because I think AI is a really tricky thing to talk about, because people mean different things when they use the term and they care about it for different reasons. So I want to be cautious not to position myself as too much of an expert, or even anyone as an expert, to be frank, because I think that the field is so young that real expertise in the policy space is hard to come by. So with that caveat, Nomshado, please. Thank you. Yeah, so the first thing I want to talk about is the nature of the technology. And I think it's useful to understand that it's an evolving concept, right? So in 1997, when IBM used Deep Blue to beat Garry Kasparov in like a chess game, we call that AI. Now we have it in like our chess.com apps or whatever, and we don't really think of it as such. Similarly, like social media is kind of structured by content recommendation algorithms at this point, which is a form of AI. It's a form of machine learning, but it's not what we mean when we're thinking about AI. Most people these days, we're thinking about large language models, right? So I don't want to spend a lot of time on the definition of AI because it's a contentious space and we could spend the next 30 minutes talking about it. I'm broadly using it to mean computer systems that can perform tasks that otherwise require human intelligence. But I think the thing that everyone's really interested in is large language models. So I want to focus on those, even though they're not the only thing. And a useful term here is foundation model, right? This is what all of there's maybe like 6 or 7 leading AI labs in America, and like ChatGPT, GPT that underlies it, is an example of a foundation model. And what that means is it can serve as, it's increasingly generalized, and it can serve as the foundation for a bunch of other different tasks on top of it, right? And I think for me, the most useful thing in understanding these systems has been this triad, as in there are three components in AI systems. There's the data that they're trained on, there's the computing power that you need to run them, aka like a bunch of computing chips, GPUs in a warehouse somewhere. And then there's the algorithms or the architecture that's actually structuring the data and using the computer power to produce outputs. And the reason I think it's interesting to flag those three things, well, there's a few reasons. One, the breakthrough that led to GPT, which was like transformer architecture developed by Google in 2017, it's the same technology that we have today, 6 years later. The only thing that's changed is the amount of data that they're training the systems on and the amount of computing power that they're using to run these systems. And what's really interesting is that thus far, there have been exponential returns to increasing the scale of data and of computing power. Now, it's not clear that those will continue indefinitely, but it's also not clear that they're going to hit a ceiling anytime soon. And I think what's particularly interesting is this idea of emergent capabilities. What that means is that these systems can do a bunch of things that the developers didn't expect them to be able to do when they created them, right? So like the ability to do arithmetic or to do complex chain of thought reasoning, like you give a logic problem. And I'm not saying they can do these perfectly, but the fact that they can do that surprised the people that created these systems, which is really weird and not like past epochs of technology where you could easily guess where they're going. And it's important to flag this because that creates novel regulatory challenges. When the people who are developing the systems don't fully understand their capabilities, how are people who are developing policy supposed to anticipate what they can do? And this is made even more difficult because these systems are largely black boxes, which is just another thing that I've already said in some ways, by which I mean machine learning systems where because they are teaching themselves and finding patterns in themselves, it's not clear to us why for a given set of inputs, the system has given an output. Like this is an active research field in machine learning called like mechanistic interpretability, but they don't know is the simple answer. And that is a concern. Two other things that are interesting to flag on the nature of the tech. One is that it's being developed largely by the private sector, which is not the case for other big technologies that have changed the world previously. And the other is this difference between a pre-trained model and a fine-tuned model. Right? So the basic GPT, for example, is a pre-trained model. It's just predicting the next thing in a sequence. A fine-tuned model is when you take that pre-trained model and then essentially you encode normativity in it. And the way you do that, the way OpenAI did it, is they hired a bunch of workers in Kenya to say, this is good, this is bad, this is racist, this is problematic, whatever it is, right? And by the process of having a human in the loop, so that's called reinforcement learning from human feedback. And by having a human in the loop, you kind of tell it how to think and what to think, right? And I'm going to come back to that because I think it's important for understanding how in Africa and how in media and how in local contexts, you can take the basic models and tune them to be sensitive to the things that you care about. So that's just kind of laying out the landscape here. Then I wanted to say a word on hype. A lot of it exists. Obviously, a lot of it seems overblown. A lot of it is just media and press statements. And we shouldn't believe the hype wholeheartedly, but we also shouldn't dismiss it reflexively, is what I think. I think what's useful to ask is what is principally possible here? Like, what do we think these systems can do? And then the question becomes, well, when will they be able to? So it's interesting. If you look, there was a recent survey last year of AI experts, and 90% of them expected something like an AI that is more capable than a human on a bunch of fronts. Like, for example, maybe it can run a Fortune 500 company or something, or it can do advanced research on AI, on drugs, on a range of complex things. They expect that 90% of them expect that within the next 100 years, and 50% of them expect it in the next 40 years. Those aren't like guaranteed to come true or anything, but I do think it's relevant for how the people developing this technology are thinking about it. And I do think it should somewhat bound our expectations. And also relevant there is the stated goals of the AI labs, right? Like OpenAI's mission is to ensure artificial general intelligence is to the benefit of humanity. And that phrase, artificial general intelligence, AGI, that's the thing I've just described. of a system that is as or more capable than humans on a bunch of fronts. It's kind of a fuzzy term, and it's not really a binary, like one day we wake up and it's there. Probably these systems will continuously get better over time to a point that one day we're like, well, that's probably it. But these people think that they're creating something like God, and I think that's relevant. For all of those reasons, governance is hard, right? So I think we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So with that in mind, before I get into like what's going on in regulation, I want to just go a bit deeper on the socio-political forces that are kind of guiding the regulation that's being made there. And Paul actually spoke about this a bit already, but the first one there for me is asymmetric AI development. And what I mean by that is, like I said, it's a handful of labs in America that are leading this basically. And second place is kind of labs in China, although we don't know as much about their models, they're kind of more constrained. But what that means is that America specifically, where these labs reside, has disproportionate regulatory influence because these labs themselves have disproportionate regulatory influence, right? If they all decide on an industry code to do thing X, well, then that's what's happening because the law is a weak constraining force when these actors are able to kind of just release whatever they want into the wild, which is what they do. The other thing is global power dynamics, and that's the fact that AI is a really strategically useful technology, right? If you're an authoritarian state, you can use it for surveillance, you can use it to track people, you can use it for military stuff. And that means that some people might not want to collaborate with the kind of like international frameworks that we might need to govern this effectively. So it affects stuff. The third thing is the pre-existing regulatory cultures, right? So the EU favors comprehensive regulation in the way of like the GDPR. They're trying to do the same thing with the EU AI Act. America is much more sector-specific, federalized, piecemeal. And the same trends that govern all the other regulation are kind of also constraining where AI regulation is going to go. So there's a certain path dependency. Then there's the wave of public interest, which means everyone is suddenly paying attention to generative AI, even though we've been talking about it, or it's been bubbling for many years. So it doesn't seem likely that that energy is going to go away anytime soon. And then this last point before I get into the meat of it is the role of civil society and advocacy groups. And I think it's interesting that they seem to largely split into two camps here, right? So you've got on the one hand, the AI ethics people who seem to care a lot about, and a lot of like the human rights organizations like Amnesty International, UNESCO would kind of fall into this bucket, where they're like, the main risks here are about prejudice and bias, misinformation, disinformation, maybe about copyright and labor impacts and challenges to privacy, which is all true. And then on the other hand, you have these AI safety people who are like, no, the big risk here is that we create an AI that is more intelligent than us in some way, and then it gets misused by bad actors. So for example, if you have a system intelligent enough to be used to synthesize like a pathogen in a lab, and then it can also take actions in the real world to email people and set that up and have it delivered, that could be really bad, right? That could be bad in the level of like nuclear catastrophe. Again, not saying that that's going to happen, but I'm just trying to flag that there's a group of people who have these beliefs and who are influencing the creation of regulation. And also maybe it could happen. I have no idea. Thanks. So next slide, please, Mashana. Sorry, next slide. Yeah. So I find this phrase, the Collingridge dilemma, kind of a useful one when we talk about regulation and tech policy. And it's just this idea that if you regulate too early, you might stifle innovation and miss a lot of the benefits that the technology brings. But if you regulate too late, then the technology has already become socially entrenched and it's a lot harder to affect it. And I mean, I think if we just look at social media, it's pretty clear a lot of this was struck on the too late end of the scale. And then it's just very hard because, you know, money is power, money is influence, and that affects the lawmaking process. So against that background, when I look at the regulatory efforts that are going on, I find it useful to break them down along kind of 4 axes. The first is the area of focus, like what is the piece of regulation trying to deal with? And there, I think it's useful to think what I was talking about earlier, this triad of, is it the data, is it the compute, is it the algorithms? And then secondly, like what analytical lens is being brought to bear? Like, are we thinking about this from a human rightsy perspective, social justice? You know, what's the framework that we're understanding it in? Then obviously the jurisdiction is relevant. Is it local, regional, national? The stakeholder involvement, is this a bunch of government officials? Is it a bunch of NGOs? Is it a mix? And then ultimately the type of document, like how binding is this? Is this just a declaration? Is this a national strategy? The reason I think it's useful to set that up is because you find regulations in the loose sense at every one of those strata, right? So you'll find like a local thing made by NGOs, and you'll also find like an international thing that's maybe a bit more binding. So yeah, next slide, please. Thank you. So when I looked at this recently, I chose kind of 4 jurisdictions: America, China, the UK, and the EU. And I was trying to understand like what's going on. The thing that jumped out to me, which is interesting, I think, is that there's a lot of consensus on the principles that are relevant in this space. And I'll talk about those principles in a second. As in all these different regions are using the same words, but then there's a huge divergence in how they should be implemented. Like, what do we do about those principles? How do we operationalize them? So I've been thinking about this, like all these regions have basically the same ingredients, but they're making different dishes. And this kind of goes to what I was saying earlier. So like the EU has a draft AI Act. It might be passed by the end of this year, but like it's still going to be negotiated a lot. We obviously don't have time to go into the details of all of these, so I'll speak at a high level. America, lots of different things you could point to. The one I highlight is the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which the Biden administration put out at the end of last year. The UK has a pro-innovation approach, which is their like national policy document, and China has its interim measures. And yeah, it kind of seems like they're saying the same thing, but they're really not. So in terms of the principles, which I think are on the next slide, there's, as you can see, everyone talks about the need for these systems to be transparent and explainable. And I maybe want to dwell on that because it's something I've been looking at. It's not clear what people mean when they say these systems must be transparent. And I think that's because there's kind of 2 senses. There's like transparency in the explainable sense, which is really very difficult for the reasons I was talking about earlier, because it's a black box, as in how does it arrive at these conclusions? And then there's transparency as in like, how does it relate to the broader ecosystem in relation to like its users, third parties, things like that. Then other principles are this, everyone is like, you got to prevent against bias and discrimination. Less clear how you do that, but everybody says it. Safety and security is a big theme. Data privacy is a big theme. The idea that humans need to be in the loop is a big theme. Sometimes questions of licensing crop up, which is kind of an interesting one. So in the EU model, every country in the EU would basically have to designate or set up a national body, and then they would have to register the systems and issue licenses for those systems to operate in that jurisdiction, depending on the risk level of the system. So that's something that people are thinking about. But again, these are all ideas that have yet to be meaningfully implemented. And just to show, I don't have the quote in front of me on the transparency, but it's in the Chinese regulations, it's in EU. But one that I do think is worth reading, which is from China's interim measures for the management of generative AI services, which was put out in like July of this year. And what it says is that the provision of these services, or rather like the people who are providing them, they have to make sure that the models, and this is a quote, adhere to the core values of socialism and must not generate incitement to subvert state power, overthrow the socialist system, or endanger national security and interests. Which is interesting, I think. Like, I don't know how they're going to achieve that because these systems are generative, which is kind of, they can be used to generate incitement. But it just shows that even if you're paying lip service to a thing like transparency, it's still going to be constrained by all the rest of the stuff that operates in the world, which I think is just interesting to pay attention to. But yeah, the upshot is that the space is really underregulated. And I think it's interesting to contrast it to physical infrastructure, right? Like if you want to build a building or a bridge, you can't just do it. You need to get licenses and permits and whatever. But if you want to build a system that can meaningfully influence people's thoughts, you pretty much can right now. Like maybe in a few years that'll be different or harder, but right now it isn't. And it's hard to see how regulation will keep pace with these systems that keep pushing forward and forward. Cool. So we can go to the next. Thanks. So I want to kind of now talk about what this might mean for the media space. And to start, I think it's useful to talk about information ecosystems, which is a phrase that I hear thrown around a lot. And what I understand by it is kind of 3 things. There are 3 components in these systems. There are the structures, the participants, and the content. So when I say structures, I mean like the legal structures, as in the laws and stuff that kind of constrain who can say what. The physical structures, as in like newspaper, cable, TV, like the infrastructure through which things flow, information flows, and then the digital structures, which is also physical in a sense, but as in like the platforms themselves, right? So like Twitter, Facebook, Google, websites, the whole online place. That's the first thing. Secondly, you have the participants, by which I just mean everybody that is like sharing, consuming, or producing information. And then thirdly, you have the information itself. And now the reason I'm breaking it down that way is because AI will and already has impacted all three of those things, right? So like I said at the beginning, if we're talking about content recommendation algorithms, those already meaningfully structure the information ecosystems that we take part in, because the decisions of these algorithms on what to show and what not to show, they decide what you see. And so they shape the incentives for the people that are creating content. And then in terms of the participants, as ChatGPT can role play as different people, which I'll talk about more in a second, they're also going to be able to be not just shaping the structures of the system, but also be talking within it. And as a result, we're going to get and have gotten a whole bunch more of AI generated information in these systems, all of which is just to say, I think that things will get weirder. So yeah, I'm not going to speak much on, I mean, I think Paul's already done a great job on a nitty gritty of what this looks like for newsrooms, how we can automate content creation, increase personalization, automate fact checking, this kinds of things. But I do think that this notion of a digital person is one that I keep coming back to, because it's hard to see how it won't happen, right? So like, if you think of the New York Times, if they decided to make a chatbot trained on all of their stories, and I'd call it Yorkie or something, I don't know about the name, and then that could be your primary interface. You pay a subscription and you talk to this person who gives you the news in a way that you want, this digital person. I'm not making any claims of consciousness or anything like that. I'm just saying the technology is there. Corporations are going to be asking themselves, how can we make money from this technology? And plausibly, this is one way. It's not a hard prediction, but I'm trying to hint at the fact that I think the future is going to be really weird. And then another thing that I think is useful to flag here is this idea of bullshit in the academic sense. So there's a guy, a philosopher, Harry Frankfurt, who wrote an essay on this a while ago. And his point, as I understood it, is basically like, bullshit is something that has no relation to the truth. So it just doesn't care whether it's true or false. So if we're having an argument where I say X and you say, no, it's not about X, it's about Y, we're at least playing the same game. We're trying to get towards the truth. But if in the context of bullshit, it's just not relevant. You know, I mean, like someone like Trump is a master of bullshit, right? Because it doesn't matter what the facts are. It's about what's rhetorically persuasive. And I think the challenge here is that the ability to generate bullshit, as in content that has no relation to the truth, has been massively increased. I don't know what to conclude from that, because it's true that we've never had a shortage of bullshit in the world, and we've never had a shortage of like propaganda and things like that. So it's not even clear that that's the constraint here. Like, will this increase misinformation, disinformation? I really don't know, but I think it's something to think about. And then maybe just a last point when we think about the media is, if we look at the trajectory of the media in the last 50 years, it's clear that there's been a steady decentralization of power away from a few kind of corporates, well, and smaller newsrooms that kind of, you know, control journalism and the media, because news was historically constrained by geography and constrained by the fact that you had to pay for it, I guess, except for radio. And that's not, I mean, I think it's interesting that one of the #1 like careers that young people are interested in is being an influencer. I used to dismiss this as being trivial, but I kind of see it now, because there's a meaningful sense in which power in society and power over narratives has shifted in this more decentralized way to what we call influencers. And like, that's the state of affairs now. And then it's interesting to ask, well, how is AI going to augment this shift? And I don't know, but I do think it's worth thinking about, because I do think it's likely the fact, and this is what Paul was talking about, the fact that any small person can now bootstrap up the ability to create their own, you know, content at speed and at scale. I think that it's going to distort the landscape even further. I think we can go to the next one. Thanks. Sorry, I probably should have prompted you earlier. But yeah, as I move towards closing, I do just want to, it feels weird standing here and saying like weird sci-fi stuff is going to happen. But it's already happening is the thing. Like, I think that I'm someone who is really bullish on like, oh, AI is going to do weird things to the world 3 years ago. But if you had told me then about ChatGPT, I think I would have been like rightly astonished. And I'm frankly still often astonished. And I was just chatting to Paul about this. If you've only used like the free version of ChatGPT and you think that that's where its kind of limit of capability is, then you've already fallen behind like what's happening right now. Because even just the difference between 3.5 and 4, which I forget the number, I think it was like a 5x increase in scale, like I was talking about earlier, computing power and data. It's much better at a lot of things. And I think that's going to continue. So yeah, I think that we're heading for a world where we have potentially like AI playing a meaningful emotional role in people's lives as a meaningful source of support and of news and of information, and plausibly of all of those things bundled into one. And this is already happening, right? Like Meta has partnered with like Kendall Jenner, who has licensed her likeness to be a personalized bot. Now, this is not very good right now, but just wait 2 years, right? Just wait 6 months. And I think things will get stranger. So on the one hand, there's that. And on the other hand, there's these notions of catastrophic risks, which I've been kind of flippant about. But I think if you think at the extreme, oh, it's as bad as nuclear weapons, then yeah, it's easy to be like, well, that sounds really outlandish, so maybe it won't happen. But I don't think you need to go much further than where we are today to see how having an increasingly intelligent system that you can deploy in any way you want could cause havoc in the world meaningfully. And we just don't have good solutions to this right now. And I think it's made especially challenging because a lot of this technology is open source. So like, even if you do the fine tuning like OpenAI did in Kenya and you encode a certain set of values, for example, Meta released their, I think it's called Llama 2, where they also released all the weights to the model, which is basically like the behind the scenes stuff. And smart people have already taken those open source models and fine tuned them to create hatred. Now, even if you pass a nice law, like if it's available for free on the internet and people can download it, it's difficult to see how you stop that. Yeah, and the people developing this are arguably better aware of this than anyone, right? And they've agreed to a set of voluntary commitments to the Biden administration on things like we're going to watermark content so that you can identify it. We're going to like do robust auditing so that, and when I spoke about safety and security earlier, auditing is kind of the main thing, as in by both the company and by a third party, before, during, and after release. You want people to be looking at the model and to be robustly testing it to see like, how can this be misused? How can we constrain that? Currently, they do this. Like if you Google GPT-4, I think it's System Card, there's like a paper that they release each time they put out a new model saying, this is what we've done. But I don't think it's enough, right? These are nice to haves at the moment. And it's nice that they do it, but other labs are not going to do it. And then I think that there are complicated geopolitical questions as well, right? So like even if the American models are fine-tuned and above board and PC and we're happy with their values, China is second in this race, and they are also developing these kinds of models, and they're also very active across the African continent. So again, like, I guess I'm giving you half a point here because I don't know how those things mesh together, but it seems important to think about. Yeah, I think we can move to my takeaways. Thank you. So yeah, I'm kind of just trying to info dump a bunch of things that I've learned by looking at the space recently. And I think, what are my takeaways? Yeah, I think that we're in a really difficult position, whether you're a media worker or a regulator or an advocate, because if you're only focusing on what the technology can do today, you've pretty much already been left behind, is what it feels like. So we need to be thinking, what can it do in 6 months? What can it do in 2 years? And that sounds cool to say, but I don't have good answers for you on what they're going to look like in 6 months and 2 years. Like some things we can maybe hazard a guess, like it seems plausible to me that the challenges of hallucination might be able to be constrained by plugging these things into the web and stuff. But in other areas, we really just have no idea. And we do know that more and more money is being poured into these systems, more computing power, more data, and probably at some point better algorithms and better architecture. And all of that means that we should just be prepared for the future to get really weird. And then on the regulation front, we should recognize that regulation is necessary, that it's nascent, it's still very young, and that means that there's a lot of opportunity for people to be advocating for a bunch of different things here. So that's kind of my high-level overview. I have thoughts on more specific things, but yeah, I'd be excited to get into it in the Q&A. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Okay, well, my is not working. I'm gonna ask our facilitator to please come up on stage. So this is your opportunity. I think after Sharon, I was sitting there thinking to myself, I've never been part of this discussion from this perspective. The way everything was broken down from AI journalism to looking at transparency, the black box nature of AI, ethics, principles, there was a lot. And I think everyone does have questions. I do have questions myself, but I'm going to put them as a building back. So Lauren, Paul, please join on stage. I'm going to open up the stage for questions from the audience.
Good morning, and thank you for a very insightful discussion. In the talks of generative AI producing news on behalf of organizations, led me, those who are old enough, to think back to Desert Storm with the embedded journalists. It eventually became the case that there was no new news coming into the cycle. The embedded journalists were reporting on each other's reports. And when that became obvious to the general public, the trust in the outcome of that journalism disappeared instantly. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the collapse of trust in journalism, as you say, once we realize that AI is generating the news we're reading by reading other AI-generated news who read other AI-generated news. It's sort of turtles all the way down, as they say in the classics.
Yeah, there's actually, my brother is a biologist. And when this started to come out, he was like, this is an end game in a biology sense, right? Because everything will just start to, as you say, like eat its own tail. Someone told me the other day that they put articles that they had written 10 years ago, right? So before all this, into GPT-0, which is meant to screen out like for, so like a service that's meant to find out if anything's generated by AI. And he was saying articles that he wrote without any help, obviously, years and years ago, were coming out with like 25% created by AI. And he was like worried about that. And then he was like, oh, that's because they've scraped the internet and maybe my article was on the internet. And now it's telling me that this article is generated by AI. So yeah, I mean, someone's going to have to write some new words at some point, like basically.
Yeah, it's interesting because intuitively you want there to be a solution to this. You want there to be like a Turnitin where you can just put in the text and then cool, it's AI. It's not, but none of them work. None of them work. And I think you raise an important question about the relationship to trust, because it's kind of the big one. And I guess that's where like there's a tight link, it seems, between transparency and trust, where it's like, well, if you're at least saying that you're using the systems, we can maybe trust you more. But at the same time, I don't know, my head is kind of just spinning being in like my own information ecosystem. And I don't want to talk about this much, but like in the wake of the horrific war that's happening right now, you can palpably feel that nobody trusts anybody. Like you think about, there's this difference between like mistake theory and conflict theory, where you, as two approaches to like being a social being, right? Where the mistake thing is like, well, we have a problem, like there's someone collapsed in front of us. What do we do about it? What are the next steps? Whereas conflict theory is like, screw you, it's my side versus your side. And you can just feel palpably that everybody has turned towards the conflict form of this, where it's like, I believe my side, that's it. I don't have a solution.
Any more questions? There's one here.
Hi, I'm Lerato. I'm also a lawyer. I just wanted to ask you, I don't know if but recently in July, there were lawyers at the Johannesburg Regional Court who were actually caught using a fake case that they've obviously got on ChatGPT. I just wanted to ask what your views are, especially because you spoke about catastrophic risks, and the other gentleman spoke about how trust is going to be difficult to build. So in instances like courtrooms, for example, how do we draw the line by trying to obviously, get the foundation of maybe asking ChatGPT to help you with your opening statements, and obviously then leading into you getting fake case law that, you know, you probably just got on ChatGPT or on AI.
Yeah, I think it's just poor form as a lawyer to be using things that you haven't vetted, right? Like, I'm not sure that, I think that the existing safeguards to ensure like accuracy and authenticity in a courtroom pretty much still apply, just because like that, it's a case in point that didn't work out for them, right? And I think it's the same thing with, everyone has access to Google now. You can have almost any information, but if you're a doctor and you're just Googling the symptoms and you're like, well, this is what WebMD says, you know, there are existing liability regimes to catch you for that. And also, you're just not going to be a very good doctor. You're not going to be very successful. So I think that this is a case where, like, if you talk to programmers and coders, a lot of their job is just being good at Google and then knowing what to do with that Google, with that information, crucially. Like, how do I integrate this into my workflow and exercise some human oversight? And I think it's the same thing here, at least in the short term. If we reach a point where these systems like are no longer spitting out fake cases and they're able to do litigation themselves, which again, I have no idea if that's possible, but if you ask me like in 7 years from now, doesn't seem impossible. I think that the world would look very different. And I think that could plausibly be a win for access to justice if you have low cost, actually trained and accurate law kind of things. But the problem here is we're playing a speculative game, so I'm not sure.
All right, we've got one in the front here.
Hi there. Thanks very much. This has been super interesting. So towards the beginning of the year, I used ChatGPT to write an article on behalf of my company, and I put it on LinkedIn. And I was very proud of that. It was like a milestone moment for me. And then a month ago, I wrote another article all on my own without any AI. And I put it on, and I was super stoked and just as proud. And I guess my question is, those are two very different stances and very accessible, obviously, for anyone. Is there a way, and I guess this starts speaking to transparency, is there a way that we can maybe formulate a matrix or a score or something to say, I'm transparent about my article, and there's certain metrics that I used AI for this, for the idea, but I wrote it myself, or I only used it to correct my English, but it's the same thought. And you maybe almost have like a couple of questions and you get a score, and that score becomes your AI transparency indicator with everything that you publish. And that might be something that could work in journalism as well. So we're not saying no AI, we're saying, be open about how you've used AI and let the person who's reading the article judge, do they trust that amount of AI inside that article? I'd just like to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. And I think the percentage or the score thing is a great idea, and something that people I think are going to kind of establish and probably kind of uniform, like a press code almost, right? You can imagine like we don't do more than 10% or something like that. I think there's, I mean, the way I've been thinking about it is almost like a Wikipedia kind of situation as well, where it gets more in depth and you're able to kind of see every aspect of everything you've done. I mean, I think there's a misleading thing that people have brought up around spell checking, right? It comes up a lot. It's like, oh, well, we don't tell people when we're using a spell checker. But I think that's kind of a misleading thing, because we're all deciding what the correct spelling is of something, right? We've all decided on that. And now, sure, you've used something to tell you that you're incorrect with your spelling, and now you've corrected it to this uniform idea of what we've all decided is the correct spelling, like regardless of color and the spellings of American spellings. But like, yeah, I think that's very different. So I think that's kind of a misleading thing in that sense. I do think we need to catalog as much as possible what we've done. I think there's going to be an interesting thing about that is if you have like, say, 10% limit, right? Or something like that in your newsroom, I guess it's difficult to know if you do 20%, how you would fudge those numbers or what that would look like. I guess that's another thing, right? But yeah, I think it's a great point. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's a novel and a really good idea. I think it's challenging because it relies on self-reporting, as far as I can tell. So there'll be incentives for like creative accounting, even if you were able to create that standard. And I agree the spell check comparison is maybe misleading, but it's weird because it's doing so many things at once, right? Because you also wouldn't disclose like, well, I use Google or I use, I mean, you would disclose sources, but there's a level of background research at which you're not necessarily disclosing. Like we're not always talking about all the ingredients that go into it. So I don't know, but I do think that our intuitions for content will change. Like, I think mine already have to some extent. Like there are certain posts where you can tell, like, I think a robot wrote this, and I know I earlier said you can't, and you can't if you do it well enough. But I think at the absolute bottom, where you just say, write me a thing, and then people copy paste it without any fine tuning or editing. Like what I think the current tools do is kind of democratize like mediocre to like good enough writing, like B+ English writing, right? And I think that will continue to be displaced by A+ writing. But I think that if in 2 years' time GPT-6 is an A+ writer, then we have a different problem, right? So yeah, I don't know.
Right, got one question in the front.
My name is Isaac Menaar. Working, yes. My name is Isaac Menaar, and I want to say something on behalf of the Press Council. So the Press Council started beginning of the year to look at journalism and ethics in AI and what should be done. So we've done some work and we're still busy with it. So first point I want to make is it seems to us that there are two key principles that need to be applied. One is that there must be the use of AI tools in the generation of any content should be declared. Just like you put your byline, there should be at the top or the bottom or somewhere there should be a format where people know what kind of tools you can use to create the content. The second one is there must always be human oversight and human responsibility for whatever content goes on. And those are the two kind of driving principles as far as we see it at the moment. We also looked at similar processes to look at ethics and AI and journalism around the world. And it's interesting that as far as we could establish, no media council or press council have so far adjusted their core principles for media ethics just because of AI. Because the general consensus is the existing principles should just be applied to using this kind of tool. Issues of fairness, balance, transparency, and so on should just be applied. And therefore, we're now in the process of compiling a guidance note for journalists in South Africa on how they should deal with AI in terms of the press code. And I also would like to invite anybody who thinks that they would like to make some input into this process, please talk to us. We would love to hear views from anybody to make sure that we have the best brains contributing to the process. The person at the Press Council who's driving this is Frans Kruger, who is one of the deputy ombuds. And we have a small team on the Press Council that I'm part of to come up with proposals that we hope we could have a first draft table in November sometime, and hopefully finalize it by the first quarter of next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. I think that was an invitation to the rest of the audience for your contributions. Is there any other burning question from the audience? Right. I think the faces are saying you gave them quite a lot of key points. Oh, yes, Steph. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Christopher from the German Embassy, and I have a question regarding the trust issue you alluded to, and also the question of the possibility of fact checking in the realm of AI. I'm sure you've all seen the pictures and videos on social media of the Ponte Tower and another tower, I think the Telecom Tower in Johannesburg, being lit in Israeli colors. So we try to fact check, and we've come to the conclusion that probably are real. We a German journalist, for example, who has looked into the issue and researched it, and who's spoken to witnesses, and who also came to the conclusion that they are. We also Googled it and found no evidence whatsoever that they were fake. But still, everybody on social media seems to be convinced that they were generated fake pictures. That shows me that trust has already eroded through the use of AI-generated pictures. And my question would be, are there any 100% accurate ways of fact-checking an AI generated picture? And how can you do this? Because apparently traditional ways of fact-checking are not trusted anymore either.
Yeah, so when I was talking watermarking earlier, that's kind of what I meant. And when the labs have committed to watermarking, that means that if like DALL-E or Midjourney or something is used to create an image, somewhere in the metadata, it should be clear and like unremovable that it was AI generated. And I'm not an expert on this, but from what I understand, like from a technical standpoint, that's possible. But practically it hasn't, and they agree that it's important and they should do it and whatnot, but they just haven't yet. But I do think that the image case is at least a little easier because there's that, you can build it into the system itself. And because it can feel like there's a lot of different, well, it's challenging because even if 90% of the AI image generators on the market decide to commit to watermarking, all you need is one actor that hasn't complied, and then it's fairly easy to get around, right? But it's at least easier to imagine what a solution would look like there in the image case, as opposed to the text case, because I've seen some people discuss how you might go about like watermarking a paragraph of text, but like seems hard, seems complicated. And that's really interesting. I thought it was fake. So like, thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the example that you bring up, that idea of people just assuming something is fake in this world isn't really, and like to my point earlier, is that there are certain people and certain things and certain topics where it's very difficult to convince someone otherwise, regardless of how much evidence you give them, how much everything you give them, right? But like, I used to work a lot with WhatsApp and misinformation in that way. And have recently found out that WhatsApp have implemented something where even if something is correct, right? So even if it's not misinformation, but if it gets forwarded too many times for their liking, it gets flagged, right, as misinformation, regardless of the content, right? Which I find like bizarre, but I guess it's just I guess they fired a bunch of people, and now that's a way that they can kind of figure that out. So that to me also speaks to the kind of thing where we can talk about it as journalists and in newsrooms, but essentially these upper systems, these tech companies are essentially controlling to a large extent what gets flagged, right, as misinformation. So even if something that's correct, if it gets shared like too many times, then it's like, this is possibly problematic. So yeah, I mean, I think on the one hand, like, to the reference of the images, it is about people kind of coming to the table on a high end level, above every newsroom, above every journalist to some extent.
Sorry, my name's Billy. I'm really maximizing on this question. I had a thought while you guys were talking, and in a sense, I think this AI thing is a bit like another revolution, like an industrial revolution, etc. And I think that, when they moved from building one thing at a time to having a process and, changing the mass of building things in the Industrial Revolution. They had to change how they measured and checked quality and all of that. They had to put processes in place that were not necessarily needed there before because they had a couple of people around one thing and the quality was guaranteed, whereas now it changed. And so could it not be said that in a similar way, we need to look at our processes of how we produce everything and introduce new guardrails, introduce new gates to check because of the mass, it's saving us time. We can do a whole lot more. In the same way as that revolution happened, can we not look at what they did and apply some of those principles? I don't know your thoughts on those.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the heart of the issue is that it is like another revolution and we do need guardrails in the process. And I guess the problem is that like, if we could just hit a pause button and everyone stops doing stuff for a while so that the safety tools can catch up to the capabilities of these systems, then maybe, yeah, that would be cool. But the challenge is that we have to be building in these processes at the same time that the systems are getting more advanced and advanced in a way that can like fox these processes. So yeah, I mean, I do think that like talking about watermarking or about getting in third parties to audit these systems, all of that is, I think, exactly what you're saying. It's about building in safety in the process. But how do you do that when the labs seem more willing to pay lip service than to like slow down because there are clear economic incentives for them to compete against each other? And also when the government is, as I was saying earlier, big on principle and much slower on, and this is how we will operationalize that principle. So that is the huge challenge.
Yeah, I think also media is in a very vulnerable space, right, to do that, as we all know. Someone said to me the other day, like, if we cared more about Google ads than we care about AI, then we might be in a better place than we are now, right? And I think that's kind of an interesting, it's kind of a flippant point, but it's kind of interesting in that sense that like, I think, like you say, like the checks and balances are going to be important, but it's going to be difficult to people to implement them when they, in theory, they don't have to implement these tools, all the stuff I was talking about, you don't have to do that. So it's going to be a sort of catch-22, and people are going to implement these things to kind of make their jobs easier or faster and all those sorts of things, or the product better. And they're simultaneously going to have to build the checks and balances in at the same time, which I think doing both those things is going to be difficult, right? So, yeah.
Thank you. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've come to the end of our program. I think what happened today is we started probing the discussion of AI and journalism from a different perspective. And I think there was quite a lot of key insights we got today in terms of going back and pondering, particularly from a media perspective, but also from a policy and regulation. And as I was listening to your inputs, I got a few key takeaways, and I hope that everyone also takes this away. AI journalism and how increasingly AI is being used when you're talking content regulation and content generation, transparency and the big black box, right? The nature of AI in that retrospect. The issue of policy and regulation and the need for clear policies when it comes to regulating AI, the bias and fairness when you're talking about, the continuation of understanding that AI is learning and mirroring our society at the same time as it's generating content, the impact on traditional media as the digital era has posed the opportunities, obviously, when it comes to reporting news. Data privacy, I think this is one thing that we didn't get to touch on a lot, but I think it's one of the aspects when we're talking AI, the importance of safeguarding citizens' data in AI-driven journalism and respecting privacy at the same time. And I think the challenges and ethical dilemmas that we are talking about when we're exploring AI in journalism as well, and the education and training as posed by Paul when it comes to ensuring that our newsrooms and our journalists are empowered with the skills to be able to use those tools at the same time. So can you please give a round of applause for our two facilitators? I think They did an amazing job in really conducting this workshop in such a way that we really got to understand and unpack it from a different lens. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I think my job is also just to reflect on the rest of our program for the festival once again. So later on at 6 p.m. we'll be back here again, and we'll be looking at online harms in the lead up to elections. So this is a big panel discussion that we'll be having. And tomorrow, once again at 10 a.m., as I said, it's a bit different tomorrow because we have quite an informal format of discussions whereby we're looking at hate speech, we're looking at whistleblowing as well. And obviously it's our last day, so we are going to be ending it with a nice thank you cocktail party at the end of our 6 p.m. event. Thank you so much for seeing the same faces that we saw yesterday, and new faces as well. Welcome. And we hope to see you guys later on today. Thank you so much. So we'll be serving a lunch just outside where you were getting your refreshments. Please stay, mingle and network and continue the discussion as well. You can definitely also reach out to our facilitators here. Thank you so much.
That's all, man. Yeah.